My name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing the last weekly roundup, wrap-up of January. Incorrectly, last week I surmised that it was going to be the last time, but things didn't pan out that way. I also said last week that I had read 20 books, and it came to 19, and because of the way Goodreads shelves things very strangely when I complete them, I did actually miss a book. So the one that I missed was Chouette by Claire Oshetsky, which was a 5-star read of mine. I really loved it, and I ended up filming a separate video on it anyway. But it's about a woman who, after growing up with a traumatic experience with her mother, sees the world a little bit differently, colors it a little bit differently, and she believes that she is giving birth to a baby owl, and the baby comes out disabled in multiple ways, and the woman and the husband both have very separate parenting techniques, both of which are helpful and detrimental to the child. It's very unhinged women, it's very dark, but it's actually quite nuanced, especially in its portrayal of the parents. Typically these unhinged women / feral women things tend to be specifically feminist, but kind of exclusionary of the male partner, where they're very toxic. And this one does have some of that. The man is invariably toxic to her and is stand-in for the patriarchy, essentially. But it's much more balanced with the parenting, and so it really surprised me how nuanced it was, and you'll see me speak more about this in a separate video at some point anyway. Then this week, I read 10 books. First on audio, I consumed An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good by Helene Tursten. I gave this 3 stars. Most people really love this. I bought into the concept and thought it executed it well, but it did nothing more for me beyond that. And so I thought 3 stars was a fair rating for it. I just wanted more nuance and some more of a literary bent on it, I guess, where she would expound on why the elderly woman is sort of doing these things. It's darkly humorous and kind of, quite fun to see an elderly person portrayed as competent, as, differently characterized than most things. I like that bit, and I understand why it's subversive and interesting, but beyond that, it doesn't do any character work and feels kind of meandering at points, and goes out of its way to do non-subtle, kind of shocking things with the character of the elderly woman that felt a little bit kind of hackneyed to me. But I enjoyed it. Good narration, good times. Next, I consumed The Story of a New Name, the Neapolitan novel number 2, Elena Ferrante, 5-star read. Seems kind of perfunctory. I love the first one. This one, in comparison to the first one, is like a masterpiece. Like, if you just read them as a duology, it would be incredible. So I'm very excited to see where the story goes from there, because the contrast between the characters, I believe it's even broken up between like childhood, adolescence, teenage years, or young adult years, something like that. Because the first one is 2, and then this one I think is just 3rd. I'm not sure though. Anyway, the writing is exquisite, the setting well realized, the nuances between the gender dynamics and the like ways in which people subtly again like love each other, harm each other, and the inability to communicate the nuances between them that enables it is just so on point, really incredible. I really liked that the character Elena kind of comes into her own, and the quintessential nature of them parting after the first book, if you know what happens, and how it develops and how they kind of come to each other and part from each other multiple times in their lives, was just something that was really heartfelt, felt realistic, very compelling, and it all just feels very like auto-fiction-y. Like, for some reason, it feels more real than an actual memoir or an autobiography or something like that. And I think there is a component of that, like Elena, and like in the novel, we don't know for sure, but she gets to a point where she wants to write a novel within the book as well. So it's diegetically taking place and maybe overlapping with the first book, for all we know. And if so, boy, that's like incredible that she pumped out a book at that young age of that quality, for one, if that's even true. But also, if not, where the divergence occurs and what she's trying to communicate as a writer, with a writer character inserted into it, and if the name is just coincidental, which seems doubtful. But yeah, just fantastic. Lots of commentary on beauty standards and performing gender, and being willing again to like have society sort of violate your identity in terms of cachet, wealth, accruing reputation, etc. And what happens to a person when they don't allow that is just really compelling, especially very difficult because it's all from the one character's perspective. And in some aspects I would have loved for it to embody the other character as well, but a lot of the mystery and the mystique and even some of the sort of revelations come from being kept in the dark, just like the character. So ultimately, fantastic stuff. I'll definitely get to the next one. It's eminently consumable fiction. Like, when I start, just like the first one, when I started it, I just didn't want to finish it, or I didn't want to stop reading until I finished it. And I think I read it in like 1 or 2 sittings and kind of resented the fact that I had to sleep. Next, I read Diary by Chuck Palahniuk. I gave this 3 stars. I don't even know how to talk about this book. So it's about a woman who's a waitress who then marries a man who is from a very particular set of islands, which I think might give it away if I talked about which islands, because I think there is real life stories or whatever about this island that telegraph what this story could be about, if I'm correct anyway. Anyway, they move to this island. She is kind of overcome with a fervor to do painting and begins to set on to like this period where she can do no wrong. She starts embodying uncanny qualities, like being able to draw perfect circles or perfect angles, like when called for. Like if someone says 45-degree angle, she could just like, whip out the brush and do an exact 45-degree angle and stuff. And then her husband is a builder who is constructing these like secret rooms where curse words and other things are hidden into the secret rooms around the houses. And when it's discovered, they begin to try to sue her because the husband has an accident of sorts and is in a coma. So it's all on her. And basically this story just gets weirder and weirder. The more rooms that are uncovered, the more the mystery unfolds, the more that she engages with her art, the more her identity is subsumed, and the more she has to sacrifice in order to produce this art that is ostensibly not even for her. And it's all written in a coma diary thing, hence the name. So it's an interesting concept, and again, it sort of is another book where I thought that, yes, it executed its concept, but did no more than that. Cheerily, it seems very much like Palahniuk doesn't have the craft for plotting. There's tons of plot holes that are just left to the reader to fill in, and that would be okay if it felt more intentional. A lot of people argue that it is authorial intent that he does that, but when you sacrifice aspects of the craft, so much so as a coherent plot, as well as the prose are just sort of fine, Again, there's like the shock value that he likes to insert. And initially it becomes bombastic and propulsive, but it becomes eventually very like tiresome and juvenilia maybe. And the pacing is quite strange. Overall, you want to consume this book for the communication of themes and also the twists that are uncovered, which I think nobody could see coming, which is fun. But otherwise, I think that's all it has to offer as far as I can see. Next is A Blade So Black, Nightmare Verse #1 by L.L. McKinney. This is in an effort for me to get to books that I've had on my TBR forever. I think this is like a 2016, 2017 book, and I rated it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It's YA. It's billed as Buffy meets Alice in Wonderland from a Black perspective, and it totally does that. I think it completely delivers on it. The writing is definitely sophomoric. Dialogue is cringe sometimes. So in that way, it sort of is emblematic of YA and a sophomoric author. I think this is a debut. But it is quite fun. There's a lot of things that SFF writers like to do, such as coin new terms that I find very cringe. For instance, the power within her when she uses her knives in order to fight these nightmares from Wonderland, which is the general intellect's subconscious manifesting nightmares that need to be destroyed, is called muchness, if I recall correctly, and I was kind of like baffled by that. It's just kind of, again, cringe. But the relationship, what made this for me especially, was the relationship from her and her mother. So it's definitely reminiscent of Buffy and her mother, but a Black woman's experience with her mother. The different upbringing, the marginalized nature of her life makes it so that she is unlike Buffy in the way that she has very limited time. She has more responsibilities. There's just like a really good contrast if you're aware of Buffy and her relationship in this. It's kind of like subtle political commentary. I found it utterly convincing and really fantastic. The world building is immediate, but again, sophomoric. It's very hard for you to feel like you're situated and know what's going on with actual Wonderland and how much of a retelling this may be. And I read this specifically first because I haven't read Alice in Wonderland, and I knew that if I had read the classic based on what I've heard, I'd be tempted to compare the two and find this one more lacking. So I gave it kind of the boost of being first. And so I can't say that I understand Wonderland very much because its soft world building principles are telegraphed to the reader in very like, when you need to know it, you know it type way, without expounding on sort of core foundational principles of the world, which make it feel kind of lacking, kind of like J.K. Rowling, where she undercuts herself all of the time when she introduces aspects that you need to know when you need to know them, and sort of misjudges when that actual timing is and fails to telegraph it or foreshadow it, etc. But overall, I mean, it's YA. I think it does what it sets out to do quite well. I probably would read the next book in the series, which is already out. I think the third one might be as well. Next, I did Hellboy Volume 5, Darkness Calls and the Wild Hunt. I gave this 4 stars. Because it's the 4th book, or the 5th book, I don't want to go too into it, but I found this to be a better effort than the previous one, mostly because the Wild Hunt begins the first and last, I guess, kind of big arc for Hellboy, which has been lacking throughout the entire series. It's always been a contained volume that feels a little bit disjointed and then is patched together with short stories that tend to excel further than the actual arcs. And the different art, the different artist is good, better than the previous ones, but I still prefer the original art. So Next, I read The Summer That Melted Everything. 5 stars. Tiffany McDaniel wrote this. Again, so for some reason I thought this was YA, and I'd been putting it off since like 2016, 2017, something like that. I went to the end of my TBR and then just started getting these books out from my bookshelves that are farther in the back because the new ones have sort of like replaced them. And this was like just the most pleasant, most surprising experience for me because it ends up being a Southern Gothic tale, which is just my jam. I love that stuff. It's obviously more contemporary, and it's just so compelling and interesting. I thought it was about the hottest day of a specific time period, sort of like a do the right thing type thing, but it's nothing like it at all, so I don't know what I've been conflating with it. But it's about a small southern town in which a man in the future is recounting his time as a boy, and in this particular summer, which is quintessential to his coming of age, yet so damaging to him that it traumatizes him, and we see why he is sort of living the way he is in the future, which is kind of like day-to-day. I think he is combating serious addiction issues. His family doesn't seem to be anywhere of the ones that he is speaking about in the past. He just seems to be like a sort of old, sad man, and we learn why. And then there's what people consider magical realism, but I don't. There is the ostensible black kid who comes to town and is blamed for all these things that are happening, of course, while other black boys are going missing. So I guess they, in their own mind, think that the problems of these people are insular and of that particular group and have nothing to do with white people, of course, because they're racist, Southern Gothic. The black boy that in particular we are most familiar with, and maybe the only real, I would say, capital C character in the book for this, is a young boy who claims to be the reincarnation, I think that would be the right word, of Morningstar, Lucifer, the devil. And he speaks very like poetically, basically in Bible verse. It's so lyrical, concerned with musicality, everything that if you've read Southern Gothic, it embodies quite well, I think. And she pulls it off, the author, which is very hard to do, especially when you want a character to be Morningstar. There's so much interiority with the boy as confronting aspects of himself and his family and his town that are unearthed just from the very presence of Morningstar, but also very smartly intersecting with racism, with class politics, with honestly so many issues, queer upbringing, coming of age, quintessentialism, like I said, both for him and his brother that he is quite close to. And the father of the family is sort of this Atticus Finch type person, but so much more nuanced and feels more real, I guess. And the repercussions of the entire unfolding, I don't want to give too much away, kind of almost fan casts the father as Atticus Finch as like having to confront things more than in Kill a Mockingbird, which I just absolutely loved and thought was brilliant. And then I just completely clicked with the prose. I love the voice. The story was absolutely everything that I look for. I do seem to be an outlier on Goodreads, at least. Most people gave it 3 or 4 stars. I think I'm the only one, except for maybe one person, that gave it 5 stars. So maybe check other reviews and stuff, but I just found it so incredibly moving and great, surprisingly apt for a queer story as well. There's just so much about it that I loved. Next, I read Hellboy Volume 6, which is the last volume that I have. After that, it's supposed to be Hellboy in Hell, but I actually liked the arc completion so much in this that I think I'm just going to leave it at that. I know there's so many more books to consume in the overall universe, but I think I've sort of had my fill for now, and I'm good with it. I gave this 3 stars overall because it does wrap up the story in a kind of fun way, but there's way more action. And I find Hellboy to be very boring when it's just about action. I think it excels more about like exploring occultism or mythology components, or basically the lead up to the action is quite good, but the action itself is, derivative because it's just a dude with a, stone arm punching people and stuff. Sometimes there's interesting conflict resolutions, but usually that's in the short stories. So yeah, overall it was a satisfying end and it was fine. And then afterwards there's a whole bunch of short stories, which was uneven for me for once. There was 2 or 3 standout ones, especially one with a vampire with a different artist that was just fantastic. But then there was others with not great art and kind of boring stories, or a good story with art that I hated, stuff like that. So it ended up being fine. And again, I have no buyer's remorse whatsoever for this whole collection. I really enjoyed the experience, the library editions, the oversized content, the sketches at the end, the explanations of the notes on each story afterwards. All that is fantastic. Next, I finished Little Constructions by Anna Burns. Gave this 4 stars. Another hard book to talk about. This book is about an unknown, mysterious, omniscient narrator who is signaling out to women in particular, but mostly it is examining a town through a very particular family, the Doe family, that kind of is quintessential in a town like this and is made to be intentionally conflated with every other small town, with every other family like this, in which the people look the other way and allow this stuff to happen. So it absolutely is about gender dynamics, toxic masculinity, people not checking these people, and trauma cycles, the stigmatism around being helped in a trauma cycle to break it, and so perpetuating it while implicating the bystanders, the narrator herself, as well as trying to elucidate the subtle violences as well as the major ones that most people are kind of concerned with mostly, as well as the deep-seated underbelly of misogyny that is, again, quintessential. So it's all about conflating everybody with the characters, down to even the characters being hard to differentiate from. Their names all start with a J. In the beginning, there is no separation from them as John and Jane Doe. And so they could be anyone. They're anonymous, but they're also, this could happen to anyone. Anybody could be in these situations. Anyone could be undergoing this abuse and therefore trapped in their own trauma cycle and at risk of perpetuating it in the future in a generational kind of mode. And it starts off with a literal bang because a woman, Jane Doe, walks into a gun shop. A clerk is completely flabbergasted as she grabs a Kalashnikov, throws some money at him, goes over, grabs some of the wrong ammunition, and goes in a taxi ostensibly to go commit murder. What follows, though, is a very circumnavigated plot in which we do find out what all happens with her going in the taxi, as well as the dynamics of the family at play. And the plot itself is probably you could do it in 50 pages, yet it's a 200-page book, because every situation is gone into such granularity that you cannot help but understand why this is happening, both from a character work perspective, it's a very character-driven book, to the very historical notions from the town to the person to the generation that the person perpetuating the action is about to do. It's very scathing, very biting. It's triggering in like so many different ways. There's abuse to children, rape, incest, shame, stigmatism around mental health in nearly every facet that you could think of. And it somehow manages to tread this line of dark humor while being contemptuous and in its condemnation of, again, bystanders being aware of what is happening and taking a blind eye to it, as well as not allowing, especially male characters, but all the characters, to get away from the notion that they are personally responsible for these things despite being traumatized completely. Because as much as we tend to reduce trauma cycle and traumatic events to less nuanced proportions, usually the most nuanced it becomes is like, well, this person did a terrible thing, but morally gray things, moral relativism, and can we really hold them completely accountable when it's this society that created them? Anna Burns says absolutely we can, because they are still the ones where the buck stops. And although we have to address the things at a systemic level, men perpetuating violence on women at a very granular, very minute-to-minute, day-by-day portion of events in which every single person is witness to or party to in the entire town, with its implications, be it faction, bystanders, main characters in the form of the Joe family, or again, this narrator as she is explaining all these things to us, are all responsible and accountable. We live in a community, we live in a society, we are at some level all responsible, as is this man who is raping this woman right now, who is abusing his children, who is committing murder, who is so broken, yes, that he often perpetuates these actions with a dissonance in which he doesn't believe that he's actually perpetuating them at that time. But so do the women, where they create wholesale these narratives that they believe in so fervently that when confronted with them, they disavow them completely and just won't bother to confront themselves whatsoever. And so if you're not willing to do that work or engage with yourself or with therapy or with the trauma that you're in, ultimately that is also your responsibility. So I found it very nuanced, very, again, scathing, biting. I didn't find it as darkly funny as other people, I think, just because I don't pick up on that kind of stuff. Like I see it, but I don't actually find it humorous, which is why it kind of clicked for me. However, I will say that unlike with Milkman, and I think this is sort of universally acknowledged, is her circumnavigation of all of these points in her digressions are less deftly handled than Milkman. So you will find that her prose are kind of like losing the thread a little bit. And so while it also makes the point, everything is there for a reason, for sure, it does lose the reader sometimes, and it is uneven. Sometimes it's completely there and you're vibing with it, or however you want to call it. And then other times it sort of feels like she made the point, but in a less optimal way than she had just done so with the previous one, stuff like that. So ultimately I gave it 4 stars, definitely recommend it if you're up for experiencing that. And next, the last book is The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak. This is a 4-star read, 3.5 rounded up. So this is about a Turkish family in Sifrit, I think is how it's pronounced, but probably not. This is a hard one to talk about as well because it's very sprawling. It's concerned with geography, with the historical nature of Turkey, and a lot of complex dynamics in its sort of de-evolution into authoritarianism, in its dissection, I guess, of class, of race, of a whole bunch of very particular topics that are like conflated often through the lens of which a lot of this is given context, which is a tree in a tavern that is so old that it's able to sort of gather all the information of history and relay it to us, the reader, in bite-sized portions, which is really nice. It's not like an exposition dump, which is great. But then there's also multiple stories that are being told throughout it. There is the notion of taking like transplanting the tree itself to another location, to a family that sort of needs it. There's heartbreak, grief, love. It's pretty fairly nuanced, yet it's hard for me to speak about those specific things because the central thing, the hub in which everything kind of pivots on is the tree, which didn't quite work for me. It is very heavily steeped in simile, metaphor, allegory, and to the point where I was just sort of over it. Also, the anthropomorphism of the tree is just something that it's like a pet peeve for me in fiction now, basically, that people assign the qualities of humanity to nature as if we can understand them, and essentially colonize the natural in order to make them a story component for us. It feels so incongruent with what the limited knowledge that we have about nature is. And there's always that pattern of we need to make society more have an equilibrium with nature, learn things about nature. Yes, sure, obviously. However, nature is also very alien to us, and so ascribing it humanistic qualities because we want them to have it as a device in a story in order to relay this information just feels very like, again, colonial, very like sophomoric, solipsistic, quintessentially solipsistic, basically. And again, I'm just kind of over it. So it's hard for me to talk about the book because I at once sort of admire it for what it's trying to do, yet kept getting, every time the tree came up, to a pet peeve of mine where I just sort of got stuck into a rut where I was just like, I don't like how this tree is portrayed, what they're doing with it, and the whole like everything, we need to uncover our roots, we need to sort of make peace with grief and history in order to know ourselves, and the main problem of humanity not having a long enough timeline or history or general intellect is been done to death. It's something I consume very often. So ultimately I did round it up to a 4 because I was stuck in the weeds. I think it is unfair for me to penalize the book for a pet peeve of mine where it's sort of the central thing that you need to, it's a conceit that you need to concede in order to enjoy the story, and I couldn't do that. So I rounded it up instead of down, despite my feelings being down here. I think the quality of the book is up here. And that's it. That's my week in reading. I will see you next video, and if you've seen any of these books talked about before, if you read them yourself, if you want to interact with me, feel free to do so in the comments below. Bye.